Last night at dinner, a couple of the speakers and I were talking about pain and hardship. It was a fairly morose discussion, but we were talking about how that so often leads to awakening and wonderful, wonderful insights that are often shared with so many people. And it's these insights that tend to touch us in a way that wakes up our compassion. And if I can just share with you one quote, a quote that I often cite, and it's one of my favourites, from Jack Kornfield. Compassion is the quivering of the pure heart when we have allowed ourselves to be touched by the pain of life. And it's one that always grabs my heartstrings. Now, you're about to hear the personal stories of two very wonderful men who know this adage very, very well. Chief Dan Daly and Wally Lewis, of course, who many of us are familiar with. Now, to help share their insights is Paul Barclay. He's a presenter on, and very appropriately, Australia Talks and Big Ideas on Radio National on the ABC. He's won a Walkley Award for his work, and he's a passionate contributor to Australia's cultural landscape as a judge of the Queensland Premier's Literary Award. If I could welcome all three gentlemen to the stage, and Paul will take things over from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and a warm welcome to the Happiness and Its Causes conference. Right now I think we have a real treat for you. Two inspirational figures who have known the highs and the lows, who've stared adversity in the face and emerged stronger, wiser, and I imagine happier. I'm sure both have some wisdom to share with all of us. One of the most overused words in my view is the term icon. But I'm happy to make an exception today and describe Wally Lewis as a genuine Australian sporting icon. The name resounds right around the country. I'm from Victoria, and even when I was following Aussie rules in Victoria, we all knew about King Wally, the king of rugby league, one of Australia's greatest players, captain of both Australia and Queensland. He represented his country in 33 internationals, and perhaps even more importantly for us Queenslanders, led the state to many victories in the state of origin. And couldn't we have done with Wally on Wednesday night? He's also well known as a sports presenter for Channel 9 in Queensland, and importantly, in recent times, his advocacy for people with epilepsy, a role he's taken on since he made it public that he had the condition. He's patron of Epilepsy Australia, and I think he's also the only man I've ever met to be immortalised in a bronze statue. You usually have to be 6 feet under before that happens to you. Also on the stage with me today is a man who directly experienced and was deeply affected by one of the most momentous events of the century so far, the attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York on the 11th of September 2011. We all remember where we were that day, and we all remember when we first saw those images. Chief Dan Daly has now retired as Battalion Chief with the New York City Fire Department, but he was in the thick of it on that fateful day. He worked extensively at Ground Zero for months after the attacks, and the events and the aftermath of that day changed his life forever. Dan received the New York State Senate Liberty Medal. He now travels the world spreading his message of peace and happiness and how we might all help to change the world. Will you please welcome two quite extraordinary people?
Thank you. Thank you.
So Dan, you're at home on the morning of 9/11, you're not at work, you get an urgent phone call, you turn on the TV, you realise something terrible is happening, you get dressed, you rush to work, you get a fire crew together, you make your way to Ground Zero, and you get there just after the towers have come down. Take us back to your feelings as you're taking in this scene of utter devastation.
Well, when we were responding, we were on buses, we were being bussed down, and a usually jubilant crew of firefighters, it was very quiet. In the distance, we could see the plumes of dark smoke coming up, and there was just silence. There was fear of what we might find there, anxiety to get there and to get to work right away. because we knew there could be 50,000 people working in those buildings. And anytime there's life involved, when there's a life hazard, it really gets our adrenaline going. So when we arrived at Ground Zero, it was like landing on another planet. Nothing was recognizable. In a part of the city I knew very well. I loved those buildings. I used to bring friends to them all the time. And here I was standing at the base of a pile of rubble, 80 feet high and 16 acres wide. And everything was covered by this thick white dust. And it almost had the feeling like after a snowfall, you know, there's almost that quiet, that surrealistic feel to it. And people were running around covered with blood, with a look of shock on their faces. As soon as I got there, I made my way into the smoke, into the pile, to try to get to the location where we could do some effective search and rescue. And I remember a firefighter walking out of the dark smoke, and he just walks up to me, and he just looks at me in the eye and said, "Father Mike is dead." Father Michael was our chaplain and a very, very respected man. And then without any further words, he just moved on. And then I kept moving in towards the pile. Another firefighter came up and said, "Captain Brethel is dead." And then another firefighter came up and said, "Stephen Belson, your good friend, is missing." One after another, it was an endless stream of people that were missing, and the horror of that day wouldn't stop for many days to come.
So are you angry at this point?
Well, I'm in shock at this point.
Disbelief?
I mean, I was looking at something worse than anything I could ever imagine, even in a war. I mean, just with the people running around, the looks on the civilians' faces of shock and splattered with blood. It was just, and I couldn't believe that this was happening in our city, that the great Atlantic and Pacific Ocean proved to be a moat not big enough to protect us.
You knew it was a terrorist attack immediately when you arrived, or you'd heard about, heard that it was?
That morning I was going to go flying. I belonged to a flying club. I remember looking up at the sky. It was crystal clear, saying, "Wow, this is the kind of day that pilots call severe clear." And I was going to go flying. I knew as soon as the plane hit that it was no accident. That building was visible for 80 miles.
In the days, weeks and months after 9/11, Ground Zero is like nothing we can imagine, is it? It's, for one, the smell is overwhelming, isn't it?
That was the worst part. And by smell, he means the burning insulation from the wires mixed in with decomposing bodies. And part of our most traumatic duty was going around with buckets to find parts of the remains of people, which sometimes were just the size of a nickel or a dime, but it didn't matter. We had to find every piece so that a family could have a memorial service. And one of my most vivid and horrifying images was when I found a woman's hand sticking up out of the earth, and it had a wedding ring on it. And to me, that symbolized, it just made it so real that this was a woman who had a husband and maybe had children, and there was a family waiting for her to come home. And now here she is, trapped beneath a girder with just her hand sticking up, and I had to recover that hand and place it in a bucket and bring it back to the morgue.
But it is amidst all this wreckage, amidst all of this human debris, that you find hope, that you start to see the best in human beings emerging amidst the worst of human beings. How is it that you are able to find a positive side from this atrocity?
Well, we were working there, and for, I guess it was about 2 weeks, and it was very, very emotionally trying business doing what we were doing. We were working 12-hour shifts. And then the volunteers started to come, and they set up a tent city right next to Ground Zero along the Hudson River, where you could go into a tent and you could get a pair of boots, you could get underwear. There were priests there where you could say a prayer. There were people even there where you could just get a hug. And I remember one of the humorous aspects of this volunteer city was that finally their chiropractors came in and massage therapists, and they set up their tables with their clean white sheets right in the middle of all this havoc. And they were going, hey, firefighter, hey, rescue worker, how about a massage? And of course, you know, the macho ethic is alive and well in firefighting and the construction trades. So we said, no thanks, we're just going to have a cup of black coffee and head back up on the pile. But, you know, fast forward 3 weeks later, after we were all digging in these holes, now you had to wait on lines behind some of those big macho guys, you know, for a massage. So they changed my attitude. The love and compassion that they brought in, the sense of community that they created, made it a special place. There was almost a spirituality that arose like a phoenix from the ashes. And it became such a peaceful and beautiful place in a sense, despite all its tragedy. And that to me became the legacy of 9/11. Not what heinous people could destroy, but look what we can build when we come together and we work together as one team with one mind.
Now, Wally, it's a great story of hope triumphing in the face of adversity. Wally, you've faced your fair share of adversity, your fair share of physical challenges on the field, emotional challenges off the field. How do you think you'd have managed if you'd been in Dan's shoes on that day?
Well, I'm glad the Americans had Dan in the chair and not me, that's for sure. It would have been very dangerous, but quite extraordinary. And I think the biggest challenge immediately would be to try and put the first feelings that you would have had to one side and being able to work the way that, okay, this is the way that we should take it. But emotion plays such an enormous role in all walks of life, and to be able to be put in a position like that would have made it extraordinarily important just to go back to, okay, this is the way that we've got to approach it, this is the common sense approach, and work from there. But the amount of an issue that an emotion would have been at that time would have been quite extraordinary.
Rugby league is a tough game. It's maybe the toughest of all, and brutal sport. How do you compare the physical challenges that you encountered on the field with the other personal challenges that you've confronted also during that time, and subsequently you found out that your young daughter, when she was 1, was profoundly deaf. You struggled with epilepsy even when you were playing rugby league, and then we all found out about it later on. What's been the toughest challenge that you've confronted?
I think that the hardest thing has been making the correct decisions at the right time, assessing everything as we went along, and I think the biggest hurdle along the way was perhaps my lack of information or education on those roles. The first time that I found out my daughter was profoundly deaf, it was the day before we played the deciding State of Origin game in 1991. It was a very difficult issue, and I made the decision to retire from footy, representative footy, straight away, because certainly my daughter's life was far more important than sport. There's no doubt about that, and I had to just try and make sure that we were well educated on all of the information before making the correct decision, what was the right path to follow to help her along. Thankfully, we were given some pretty good advice along the way, and I thank all of those people that provided it for us. Of course, she's had a cochlear implant now, and I think the best way to describe has it been successful, every night about 10:30 we hear that damn stereo in the car coming down the block, you know, boom, 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 boom. And my wife, I say to her, do you think it was the right thing we made, having the cochlear implant put in there? She's keeping everybody on the block awake. She'll walk in and I'll just sort of smile and, oh, sorry, Dad, it was a bit loud, wasn't it? You know, and I said, yep, it certainly was. With my side of things, I probably put ignorance rather than a lack of understanding. It was something that I didn't know too much about. When I had the epilepsy at 19, I didn't really find out for sure until 6 or 7 years later that it was.
It's extraordinary, Wally, that you played your entire career as a rugby league player took place while you had this condition as someone suffering epilepsy, yet none of us knew about it. You were the tough guy out on the sporting field. Did you ever run out on the field and fear, gee, it could just flare up at any moment here?
Probably knew that it could at some time somewhere. I had my fingers crossed that it wouldn't. It did on a couple of occasions out in the field. Going through the first Q&A I had with some of the doctors, I had to answer a question: how many times had I suffered head knocks? It was a little bit difficult to answer that, and when it was put down as yes, concussion, that's exactly what we were talking about. One of the ladies said, would it be 2, 3, 4, 5 times? And I said, what each season you're talking about? And she sort of looked and said, how many times would this be? And I said, oh, I don't know, 50? 60 times? I don't know. It happens all the time. You're talking about just the ones where you get a bit wobbly or where you get knocked out rotten and can't get up. I had to clear things up a little bit, and the biggest problem for me was trying to work out whether I'd inherited the epilepsy, whether it had been brought on by a series of head knocks. But to me, the biggest hurdle was perhaps getting over, I don't know whether I was embarrassed to say that I had epilepsy or I was just trying to dodge the issue at hand, and that was trying to get over it. I eventually came in contact with Paul Wade, the former Australian soccer captain, and it was just under 12 months following his surgery where I eventually got the opportunity to talk to him a little closer. But on one occasion I'd spoken to him, I heard his brother say that he'd had epilepsy, and I sort of sprung to life and wanted to ask a lot of questions about it very quickly. What's it like? And I asked 1,000 questions. I didn't become far too educated on it until that night, of course, where I just made my mind up in some way, shape or form that, yep, I'm going to promote it to the world by having a seizure on air. And thankfully, it turned out the best thing for me to do.
Yes, it is. I mean, maybe you can laugh at it now, but it's one of those events, isn't it, that so many people find out about what you're facing through that one night on TV. 2 million people or so watching it on the television, and you really have no choice, I suppose, but to come forward then and let people know what you're facing.
Yep, yeah, tell everybody exactly what it was. I knew that I'd had, I'd been dealing with epilepsy for 25, 26 years. It was probably one of the rare occasions where being in the media or spotlight, I was able to keep things very quiet. I had a very chosen group of people that knew about it, and I was very determined to keep it quiet. But I put that moment down to the lowest point of my life. Certainly there's no doubt about that. And my doctor said, but that couldn't be the case. Mate, you shouldn't have worried about it too much. If to just have a seizure, you're just at least releasing that. And I said, well, if you can have it in front of 2 million people and then sit there and urinate in your pants while you're reading the news, that was the worst that I'd ever felt. And I knew that at that stage there was no reason why I should keep it quiet any longer. I'd promoted it in the worst possible way, and just to go ahead and make a decision to have the surgery was something that needed to be covered quite quickly.
Was it a relief finally being able to tell everybody?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I can still remember speaking to the journalists and saying that, look, I've had it for a long, long time. I've hidden it, but I've got epilepsy now. I'm going to deal with it. Thankfully, everything's followed the correct path. And the thing that I enjoy more than anything else in life now, even better than footy, is being able to speak to people that have been disturbed by the event where they're informed that they have epilepsy or somebody in their family does. And just to be able to provide some information for them makes me feel more comfortable than any time in my life.
Well, you too, Dan, share in the joy of helping people get through difficult times now, don't you? After having pulled yourself through an incredibly challenging time, you work and speak in prisons, at school, you inspire people, pass on the lessons that you've learnt. What's your message to people who are doing it tough?
Well, I feel that all of us have a voice, and that we should never feel that who we are is not good enough, that we can stand up and really make a difference in our world. And I felt that way after 9/11. I was very angry, very bitter, and I could have went a lot of ways, drugs, alcohol, or whatever. I was originally planning to be sailing in my sloop in the Caribbean with a pina colada in my hand, But that seemed a little bit shallow after 9/11. So I said, this is seared into my consciousness. It's part of the fabric of who I am. And I knew that for the rest of my life, this will be with me, so how am I going to treat it? So I said, I'm not going to go down with this. I'm going to make an effort so that this type of thing doesn't happen again. So I started an outreach to children, to to young kids, because I think, if we thought this was crazy, a heinous act, unexplainable, how about our children who are just inheriting this world? So I decided to go out and speak to young people, and actually I was here in Australia for 2 months last year, and I gave 44 presentations to schools around the country on what I call the 5 golden keys. I asked myself, if I was a young person, and for that matter, any age person, what are the 5 things that I know now from my experience at Ground Zero, from my prison work, from my work with the Children's Wish Foundation and our wounded veterans? What are the things that would be most valuable for someone that I could pass on? So I wrote it down in these 5 golden keys, and then I picked up a leaflet when I was here in Australia last year, and it said, happiness and its causes. I said, wow, this was meant to happen.
Yeah. So you feel a calling in
a
way.
I call it my peace journey.
Yeah.
And I've been to over 200 cities internationally, and I'm going to continue doing it because it's what I found most interesting, and there was a lot of talk about compassion and empathy today, is that when you do forget about your ego and you reach out to another human being, my God, it's so relieving. And you feel so connected to the community. I've never felt better about my life and about the role that I'm playing as an individual as I am now. So
you believe we can change the world, each of us, one by one?
Oh, one by one, I believe it. And I think we can start every morning when we get out of bed, when we put our feet on the floor, instead of complaining that we're little clods of grievances and complaints, that we say to ourselves, thank God for this beautiful day, that I have some precious moments to go out and share with the people I love and serve the people in my life. And I found that just doing that little 30-second speech to myself every morning sets the tone for a much better day.
Yeah, and Wally, you too get so much joy. You were telling me about the fear of this operation that you had to have, where you get a fairly large chunk of your brain cut out, and people here may have seen the photograph of Wally, the scar down the side of his head, and it's no doubt we would all have been fearful in those circumstances, but you overcome the fear. You also overcome depression, really, that you had around that time when you had to leave your job on Channel 9, and now you find just about the most rewarding thing you've done in your life is meeting up with others who've gone through that operation, keeping in touch, and talking them through the challenges that they face. Yeah,
that's for sure. We were just talking before we come on. The shape of the scar was in a question mark, and of course, all the football players said, "Is there any brains in there?" Too tough a question. Sorry to ask that. But the thing that I enjoy most now, I've got to say, is speaking to the families, either people that are dealing with the condition of epilepsy or their families. It's a pretty tough decision for mums and dads to make. Should they go through with surgery? Should they not? I can't tell them whether it's the correct decision or not, but what I can talk to them about is some of the issues that the patient deals with. Give them some advice along the way and try and put them in the hands of some wonderful people. I'm actually going up to the Sunshine Coast tomorrow. The man that was in charge of my surgery, Professor Gavin Fabini, he's having a conference up there. He asked, would I mind coming up and telling the doctors what it's like on the patient side? I feel graced to be asked to go up there. This is a bloke that's helped turn my life around and made life fun again, taken away any thoughts of ending it, and I can only see that it was the depression that was causing that. So any bonuses that we can cause for a humour to feel a little bit more comfortable, for them to feel like they don't need to resort in some very strange issues, and I think I feel a lot better off, that's for sure. Very privileged.
Yes. We almost have to wrap this up, but Dan, a number of your colleagues in the New York City Fire Department, macho guys, really couldn't cope with 9/11. They hit the bottle. Gentlemen ended up fighting one another in the fire stations. What do you say to people like that who are struggling through? You're somehow got the mettle to pull yourself through and be able to see the positive side. How is the wisdom that you've attained over these years, how can you pass it on to people who don't quite know how to get themselves out of that predicament?
Well, you ask them to step back from the situation they're in, if they can, and to realize the bigger picture, that this event isn't the only thing that's going to be happening in their life. And if they can step back, and especially by reaching out to other human beings, It's been a tremendous panacea in my life and for other people to reach out and help other human beings. When you take that attention off yourself, it's so liberating and so freeing.
And finally to you, Wally, you're known because of your football. You're one of the greatest rugby league players of all time. You look back on your career now and you look at the challenges you faced subsequently, the decision to leave the game when you found out that your daughter was deaf. Does football somehow pale now when you look at the broader picture of your life?
Pales into insignificance, that's for sure. Love the sport, always will, but there's much more important things in life than sport or the particular code that you follow. Health and well-being of the humans is certainly at the top of the tree.
Look, it's been a terrific session. Will you please give a great big round of applause to Wally Lewis and Chief Dan Daly?
Thank you. Thank you.